All right, you ready to do this?
Yeah, sure.
All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have some guests today. Jason Anderson. Jason, welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. Nice meeting you.
All right. So Jason served 20 years in the RCMP, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Correct. And medically retired in 2021 after recovering from PTSD stemming from his policing career. He transitioned to a career as a social worker, psychotherapist in Brantford, Ontario, where he works with public safety personnel and the general public in working through their traumas. He's currently volunteering with the county CISM. What does that mean?
The Critical Incident Stress Management Team.
Okay, CISM team as mental health support. In 2019, he assisted in the establishment and functioned as the main facilitator of a peer support group for public safety personnel and military. Jason, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here.
All right. So before we get going, and do you prefer Jay or Jason?
Either or, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are right now.
Originally from, in Canada, of course. So, the Great White North. Started off, grew up in a place called Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is central Canada, just right above North Dakota, if you want to kind of map it out. Spent my, childhood in Winnipeg, grew up there. Even my policing career, when I started that, took me back to Manitoba. Then eventually transitioned out to Ontario, and now Brantford is home base for me, and that's the birthplace of Wayne Gretzky. If you're a hockey fan,
Okay.
People can identify Brantford that way. Just outside of Toronto, we're about 90 kilometers from downtown Toronto. So,
isn't he famous for saying, "I don't go where the cup is. The puck is. I go to where it's going to go." Something like that.
And his kind of the famous quote that every hockey coach throws out is that you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Right. Love that.
Right.
All right. So very interesting. When I read your bio and I think police and I think therapist, and maybe this is cliche or naive, but in a sense, at least culturally, we think of them, we place them on kind of on opposite ends of a spectrum. That's my general feeling of how culturally it's associated. But let's hear, how the heck did you get here?
Okay, so it's the policing side of it was actually a childhood dream that I was able to kind of get into because of the social work aspect that I started off with. So I started working in the social services field as a youth care worker back in 1992. I was working in a residential treatment center, working with kids that had gone through the foster care system, specialized foster care system, group home system, and were too much of a risk to themselves because of their behaviors, that they were in this kind of secured residential facility. And that was my introduction into the world. I was actually in the Faculty of Social Work at the time, and started this to kind of gain more practical experience so that, when I'm working with people, I have a better understanding of where they're coming from. So that became my interest, and I found out I loved it, and it really just suited me. I enjoyed that connection that I was having with the kids I was working with.
Transition. If I may interrupt, how did you get there in the first place? What lured you to that, drew you to that environment in the first place?
Well, I was in university. I was in my intro to economics class, and one of the guys that I met in my social work classes was sitting beside me, and we just struck up a conversation, and we became friends along the way, and a job opened up at the place that he was working at. And he said, have you ever thought of working with kids? And then that kind of started the ball rolling at that point, in the introduction into youth care work.
And what do you think about yourself allowed you to do that work?
I think part of it was just that desire to understand and really be able to put the academic stuff I was learning into a practice and see it firsthand. And considering this, the youth care workers were the hands-on for the treatment planning and case management aspects of that job, it felt like a natural fit. It just
Mhm.
really would check off enough boxes for me to say that I'm going to get what I'm desiring out of this position. And then, of course, you start connecting with people on a human level, and that's addictive in and of itself because
Mhm.
you get to hear their stories. You start understanding all the things that happened to them in their life to get into that position.
Awesome, awesome. All right, so you do that, and then you said that the social work kind of moved you into the policing. And help me understand here, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, is that analogous to our police here in the States?
It's our national police force
Okay,
in Canada. So it's kind of, if you were to take the FBI, Secret Service, DEA, ATF, and combine them into one police force as a
okay,
catch-all,
okay,
along with municipal policing or state policing. So that's all the facets of the RCMP. We do everything from small town policing in rural settings, traffic in those same provinces, and then up to the larger investigations that involve international or inter-province.
okay. And is the RCMP, is that the only police contingency you have in?
No, in Canada, so that's the national police force, and in
Okay,
some cases, the provinces would have deals or kind of contracts with the RCMP to handle all policing.
I see.
But there's other places that have city police will have their own, or cities will have their own police force. Some provinces have their own provincial force
Okay.
on top of the RCMP. So it's a very layered kind of justice system that we operate in policing ways.
Interesting. All right. So talk to us, walk us through that evolution from social working to policing and so forth.
Sure. After the youth care piece, I actually transitioned into an employment counselor was the official title, working with that same population as they're aging out of the system to help them kind of get on their feet from a care situation into independent living. Then went and did straight child protection work with Winnipeg Child and Family Services. And I was an abuse investigator. So I was doing intake investigations for physical, sexual, and emotional or psychological assault cases.
That sounds
And
intense.
during that time, it was always working towards this goal of mine. And I got a phone call that said, Jason, are you interested in coming out to training and joining the RCMP? Because I had started that process. And like I said, this was a childhood dream for me. So it was a very quick and easy, yes, I will do this.
Hmm.
And it's kind of ironic because one of our family friends, when I was growing up and I had tried out for one of the police forces, they said that, if you really want to get some experience of what that exposure as a police officer might be, you might want to try social work as a career first.
Hmm.
And that's what prompted me to get, one of the things that got me into that idea of becoming a social worker as a backup plan almost of getting me to my final goal of becoming a police officer.
That's interesting. I would be surprised if in the States someone said that. We don't think of that. Why is that? I mean, I think that's awesome, but clarify that connection.
Well, when you think about, a frontline police officer, there's kind of two ways of seeing it. One is you see the big moments, the real heavy involved police activities. But the other side of it is the police are usually the first people that arrive when a person's in their moment of crisis.
Right.
And in that moment of crisis, you're not going in usually with a heavy hand or kind of an enforcement mentality. It's you're trying to calm the situation. You're trying to find out what happened. You're trying to seek out the information. And that's exactly what social workers do in some cases, right? It,
Right.
it, it really is a mirrored image at times of what a social worker does.
That to me sounds amazing and awesome. And I think here in the States, and correct me if I'm wrong here, we seem to be doing it the opposite way. It seems like now, at least, culturally, we seem to be realizing or recognizing, or the police force at least seems to be recognizing that they need to really step it up and assume that kind of approach.
Mhm.
So, all right, you get into the police force. What happens? How long were you in there?
Uh, 20 years in total
Wow.
for my career.
Jeez.
So I started off in a small, isolated fly-in reserve or First Nations community, about 720 kilometers north of Winnipeg. So if you look at a map and you see Hudson Bay in northern Canada, it was basically 50 kilometers south of Hudson Bay. So kind of high northern territory area, not quite the Arctic. And that was my first posting.
Mhm.
And from that, then I started moving on my southern journey down closer to more of a big center. Did further kind of First Nation policing, then did a small municipal town, then got into Winnipeg and started going into the specialized sections. I became a drug investigator for a while. Did some larger scale biker enforcement investigations, and then eventually transitioned out to Ontario and did national security investigations, international drug smuggling investigations. And along that way, it got to a point where 20 years of policing, you're going to be exposed to a bunch of different things that most people wouldn't even imagine happens. And you start collecting those traumas yourself. And finally got to the point where it became, pressing for me to start dealing with that part.
So are you able to be specific that most people don't imagine? I mean, what impacted you? What affected you?
I think, I talk about the idea that when we get into policing, we have this kind of view that we're going to experience, some pretty ugly situations, right? We're going to experience the sudden deaths. We're going to experience the graphic car accidents. But I think the reality kicks in once you're in that job that I'm prepared for those big events to happen because I knew I was getting into it. What I was finding is that there's all these smaller little incidences, these small traumas that are happening, almost if we used a little t kind of analogy of trauma, that had little quirks to them. They touched on a moral aspect, or they impacted me because of a similarity to a personal experience. Those are the ones that really started kind of hitting, and they're not really the graphic calls that you would
Mhm.
think of. They're more
Can,
of
can you
these.
be more specific?
Yeah, I guess one of the biggest ones for me was a death that occurred with a newborn infant and having to witness that kind of series of events as they happened,
Right.
without the ability to respond and kind of act in a way that you felt you should have been acting, but because of the role that you were in, you had to take a back seat and just bear witness to it.
So what, for example, what would you have wanted to do, or how would you wanted to act and felt you
Well,
couldn't?
yeah, I think because of that situation, seeing that an ongoing death occur, you want to be in a position where you can comfort, where you
Mhm.
can respond in a caring manner. But as my role of a police officer, it wouldn't fit for that situation, and that there was others that were present that would have been in that role or be kind of a better option for responding in that situation.
Yeah. Wow. That's a really good example, and I could see how examples like that obviously could accumulate, and it sounds like they did.
Yeah, I think there's a number of those kind of incidences that have happened over the years. Like I think of some of the ones where you get into a fight and what you think is just going to be a more physical arrest turns into a situation where you're making a life or death decision and coming to a realization for yourself that if this progresses to the next step, then I've got to take action to end the
Mm.
threat or bring that threat to a closure. So it really played a lot on the moral aspects for me, those situations that really brought everything to a head for myself.
And while, I mean, you described a 20-year career, my gosh, while this was going on, were you, quote unquote, dealing with each of these incidences in the wake of them? Or did it just get to a point where, or points where things accumulated and you were like, holy crap, I need to take a break? How did it hit you, impact you?
It Unfortunately, the nature of policing is that you don't get a lot of chances to deal with situations. The witnessing the infant death was one aspect where I can tell you that I'm dealing with this death of an infant and everything that's happening. but I'm not able to process it because I go back to the office, start the paperwork, and then I'm called out to a bar fight.
Hmm.
So you're never given the chance to really sit down afterwards and say, okay, that was a messed up situation. I've got to deal
Right.
with it. It's just a layered call upon call upon call. And depending on the call volume, you might not be able to get back to that situation for a couple of days to really look at it and process.
Right. And my guess is the police force didn't have, or did they have a therapist or someone, a counselor that you could go to? Did they even encourage that?
No, and that's kind of the issue with policing right now that they're trying to fix, right? They're recognizing that on these serious incidences, we need to step it up and start doing some of that intervention earlier on to at least address the acute aspect of it and settle
Right.
some of those original or initial kind of thoughts that start surfacing for the officers.
Right, right. And I guess this is what I was alluding to when I said initially, you kind of, we, I think here in the States, place, social work and policing in on opposite ends of the continuum because, in a sense, they require a certain uh, what ability or facility, um, an immediate facility that, right, you need a working mindset to do policing,
Mhm.
right? How, at what point did this stuff hit you and you were like, I need to get out?
Well, you know what? I was going from Toronto to Vancouver, so it's a 3.5 hour flight. And at this point in my career, just before all this kind of came to a head, I'm moving up, I'm advancing, I'm kind of taking on more duties. I'm looking at my next promotion, getting ready for that. I'm kind of where I want it to be career wise. And I'm on a plane and I figure, now's a good time to watch a movie. So I was going through the catalog and I find American Sniper um, on there, and I started watching it. And it's an enjoyable movie. But then when Chris Kyle goes to the nursery in that one scene, I'm bawling my eyes out on this plane
Mm.
that's 30,000 feet,
Oh my
and I can't
gosh.
figure out what the heck is going on or why. I then kind of get myself together. My coworkers a couple of rows up, so I don't want them to see me crying. So bring myself together and I keep on watching the movie thinking, okay, it just something I might be tired or, whatever excuses that we give ourselves to kind of normalize our behavior in that moment. And then another scene comes up and the exact same thing starts happening. And I'm a complete wreck. And as I'm trying to deal with this feelings that I'm having, the announcement is that we're coming in for our landing into Vancouver. So it's
Mm.
a quick kind of, let's package everything up, push it down as much as possible. Let's stay focused on getting yourself together to present for your coworker. I then go to the conference that I was heading into town for, and I was struggling during that entire time, trying to figure out what the heck is happening to me because there's this huge upheaval. I spent much of one night kind of wandering around town just trying to sort out what's happening in my head. Why am I feeling this way? Why am I going from, being mad to crying to all different emotions in a matter of like seconds? And then finally the next morning it hit me and it's like, okay, it's the baby. It's the death of the infant that
So
really
in
is.
in on the plane, you didn't put two and two together and realize that you were being triggered by the infant.
Not at the time, no, not at
Okay, right,
all.
right,
And but it has been one of those calls that always stuck with me, right? It was one of those ones that, when you talk to a police officer and you'll say, like, what are the calls that you remember? Well, this was the one that always came up for me. This was
right.
the top one. But it wasn't until the next morning before I start flying out that I realized, okay, this is what I'm dealing with. And I think it was actually a benefit for me because at that point I was able to say, okay, if that's what it is, I know where this is going. I know that this is kind of the start of this process that I'm going to have to do. And I was able to make the phone calls I had to make sure that I was coming back to a situation where I would be supported. So I had actually arranged for my first assessment while I was waiting for my plane, and started putting those pieces into place for myself to make sure that I had a care team waiting.
Wow.
I also talk about kind of, that phone call. And it's one thing that I used to do in my presentations to peers is that when you get to that point of you having to make that phone call, that phone is 1,000 pounds. It is not as
Mm.
easy as just picking up a phone to get help, because at that point you're ripped open and you're calling for help. And it's such a strange feeling that unless you've been in that moment, you don't know the weight of that phone and just dialing that number to say, help me.
So I appreciate you sharing that story and appreciate you saying that. What talk a little bit more about what was going through you when you did make that decision, did say to yourself, I need help. What is that like? What was it like for you?
A lot of shame. I think it's very clear that in that moment when you're recognizing that you're fallible, that things didn't work out the way that you wanted them to, shame comes on big. And it's a matter of kind of recognizing that shame and putting it in perspective, through therapy that really got me out of it. But that moment of asking for help, shame was definitely there. And then I noticed the other one that I made sure I did was, because I took this approach of throwing back the curtains on this. I called my wife when I was at the airport, to tell her that, you know what, I just need to let you know that I'm coming back and I'm broken. Something's happened to me that I just realized that there's a lot of things going on, and kind of gave her that prep. And I think that was for me, one of those, when I look back on that journey, it was one of the most profound things I could have done. Because when you talk to clients now that are going through the same thing, the amount of secrecy that we carry because of that shame, that, something's not right with me, I should be able to handle that. We try to isolate and we try to protect ourselves and we get really secret. And I think the fact that I didn't keep that secret and I made it very open in that moment, it changed the perspective for me. And I got the support that I was needing in that moment in order to just make it to the next day and move forward.
Well, kudos to you, and definitely for stepping up and being open and honest with with yourself. Jay, how long had you been in the RCMP at this point?
At this point, it was roughly 18 years.
Okay. And up until this point, had you ever shared any of this with anyone, any of your colleagues?
No, you know what? In fact, quite the opposite. You used to joke around about them. You didn't, you tried to downplay the severity of things,
Right.
and you get into that trauma talk or war porn conversations with your coworkers. And it became a one-upmanship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, oh, you went to that kind of call? Well, I did this call.
Mm-hmm.
And you didn't see the severity of it. You didn't understand that that's a sign that that was impacting you and you're trying to get it out. I like to refer to those as the pressure cooker moments where, you're going to call after call, experiencing all these traumatic events in your career, and you get together with your coworkers, and that's your steam valve. You're able to talk in a joking way about these real serious situations, and it lessens the pressure so that you can go on for another couple of weeks or a couple of months until your next big kind of blowout with your coworkers.
So what happens? You get off the plane, you make the call, you call your wife. Um, you made an appointment with whom?
uh, a lady that changed my life, a psychologist that I was connected with, who, in this, I think that she was the one that really helped me put everything in perspective along the way. She just had a way about her and was able to kind of reassure me that what I was experiencing was normal. And I
Wow.
think part of that was in my process with her and kind of talking back and forth, when I kind of got into the real meat and potato details of the infant death. And I looked up and looked across at her, and she's bawling her eyes out with me. In that moment, it just normalized that no, this wasn't, me being crazy about this
Wow.
situation. This was a crazy situation that was impacting me. And that perspective change was
That's
phenomenal.
amazing. I appreciate you sharing that. It's amazing because for me, and I mean, what I'm hearing you're saying is that she was feeling, she allowed herself to feel in that moment and be a human being and not some psychologist who's going to help you and fix you. So how did you find her?
I made a couple of phone calls to resources that I knew in the area. And one person said, like, I can't help you, but reach out to this person at this location. They should be able to get you in.
Wow. So you got really lucky.
Yeah, the planets align. I say that, if you think of the clogs on a clock that are coming together, it all kind of struck together right at noon, and everything worked out perfectly for me getting that entry into therapy.
Right. Wow. I mean, that moment um, that you just shared about her reacting to what you were saying is beautiful. Um, and it allowed you to feel like you weren't nuts and you weren't crazy and you were normal. So what happens after that? How do things unfold for you?
I think, we started going through the process of processing traumas, and that normalization that was so important to say, like, yes, you had some pretty outlandish experiences, and any one of these situations by themselves could have caused you to have PTSD. And you have, I think we kept track for a while, or at least I did for a while, of kind of how many calls we're talking about
Right.
that were these big ones. And you just kind of realize, like, man, this is 20 years of this stuff. And
Wow.
how much is there? And I think as we started going deeper and deeper into them, you started pulling out more and more, and recognizing that, okay, it's not these big T traumas. Like, yeah, they have a flavor to them. It's all these little T traumas. It's all these
Mhm.
moral injury aspects. And then the sanctuary trauma of not having that support after these serious calls, and how you were treated after these serious calls. It really caused a lot of the extra damage that I was experiencing. And she was great at it. She broke it down, and we processed all aspects of it.
Mhm.
And it was a wonderful experience. I say something that um, really throws people for a loop when I say it. And it's that I'm grateful for my PTSD now, because that experience of having PTSD taught me so much about myself that I could never have done without it.
Well,
It opened me
such
up.
as what?
Well, it got me into becoming a therapist and returning to social work, for one example. But I think it changed my perspective, and I started living again because of my PTSD. When you have PTSD, it's like you put on a pair of glasses, and that those glasses are a negative filter where
Mhm.
everything you view and see is negative, right? You could see a flower blooming, and you're going to see the negative aspect of it first,
Right.
right? And what PTSD allowed me to do, and processing that PTSD, was take off the glasses for the first time in 20 years and say, oh, look, that's a lovely flower there, right?
Wow.
It changed. And that's kind of what I started really basing my life off of, is that gratitude aspect of it, that I could keep on fighting with the PTSD diagnosis and everything that's happening with me. But changing that perspective on how I viewed it became instrumental, because then I started dancing with it and learning how to move with it.
So at what point did you left the RCMP to become a therapist full time?
Well, because I was off work and had some, extra time to myself, I started kind of going back to school and upgraded to get my master's, so that I could go into the clinical world. And part of it was just this really organic process of therapy, of opening up and becoming true and authentic to yourself, and
Mm.
seeing kind of, do I really want to continue in this meat grinder called policing? Um, I know what will happen if I keep on going forward with it. Maybe it's time to change. And that became stronger and stronger. And I think some of the interactions with people at work, and kind of an ambivalence that is there, and the stigma that's attached in policing when someone is off with PTSD, really started showing itself to me. And I realized that that's not what I wanted for my life anymore. And I wanted to return to that one-on-one, really helping aspect that I enjoyed before.
You talked about, you know, becoming authentic. What was that? I mean, I think it's a challenge for many of us, but how was it a challenge for you? Or was it a challenge for you?
Oh, a serious challenge, because I think when you talk with first responders and public safety personnel, or even military, you start really seeing a kind of a dual aspect that people put themselves into, right? So for me, I was Jason at home, but then I put that uniform on, or I put my badge in my pocket, and I became Jason, the police officer. And you think that that kind of separation puts that armor on you and that you're safe. So it starts, feeling good, and it's your way of coping with some of the stuff that you're seeing, because, I'll take my uniform off after my shift and I'm back to just being Jason.
Right.
But then when it starts,
It's that simple.
yeah, apparently that's how it should be, I guess. But when you start realizing that there is no dual nature of it, you are Jason regardless of what you're doing. You start understanding that some of the things I was doing in policing weren't aligned with who I was as a person, even going into policing. Some of the experiences I was going through rocked me to the core at times, and at some point you have to be able to step back and say, this isn't who I am anymore, or this isn't who I want to be anymore. And really start making those changes. And I think that's where the authenticity came in, where I started understanding that part of the reason why I got PTSD was I cared too much in some of these situations. I really did invest more of myself emotionally than just that kind of stoic police attitude and approach.
So what would you say your mission is now? I mean, first of all, the arc of your story is really inspiring, and you are definitely, a really inspiring person to be able to share what you're sharing now, to do that, and to, recognize and honor what was going on with you. That's amazing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You're welcome. It's really, that's what I hope this podcast is about, to celebrate people like you who are doing it. Have things shifted for you in terms of how you're approaching the work you do now?
Yeah, very much so. One of the things that I do on my intakes with every client, especially my first responder, public safety personnel, I tell them my story. I give them a little blurb about my story. And I explain to them that, I sat in that chair. I was the client at one point, and I know exactly how you're feeling just being in that chair in and of itself. And during my interactions, I'll bring out parts of my story with the intervention that I'm trying to, have them look at, or the perspective change I'm looking at with them. That is a very much that normalizing piece that my psychologist gave to me. Because when a client starts talking about a flashback, for example, well, I know intimately what flashbacks are like, when the onset on them, the repercussion and the aftermath afterwards. So I'm able to kind of hit them at that different level of understanding, and it opens them up, and they start sharing more of that experience, because it's not someone that doesn't understand.
Right.
The other thing is that it really does speak to that approach that I really took on with clients, and that's that human approach. I think my experience of having someone sit across from me being human really set the stage for me as a therapist, being able to sit in a room, listen to the worst stories you can imagine, and be human with that other person.
Awesome. Wow. Jason, what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
Through my email, jason@balancedthoughts.com.
Okay. And
is probably the best.
All right. And your website is balancedthoughtscounseling.com.
Yeah, that's the professional kind of practice that we're running.
Okay. And we'll have that linked up here at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Jason, man, I, again, so appreciate you coming on here and sharing your story. I'd love to have you back at a later time. Man, just incredible what you've been through and how you've gone through it. So I want to thank you so much for being a part of this podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and I'd be more than willing to come back anytime.
All right. Good meeting you, sir. Take care.
Nice meeting you.